afternoon, everybody. How are you? Good. Feel free to come closer, but no pressure. You can stay where you are if you'd like. My name is Brian Corr. I've been asked to be the moderator of this session, and for your vocational information, we are at Improving Law Enforcement Through Data. So this will say quickly who I am. My name is Brian Corr. I work for the City of Cambridge. I have a couple of different roles: director of our Peace Commission, where I do a lot of things around community building and community events and response to traumatic events, one of which we had very recently in our city. And I also do civilian oversight of the police department, which connects to a recent traumatic event. And I serve as the national president of an organization called the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And we're a collection of civilian oversight agencies and practitioners from around the country. So through the good offices of Professor Christopher Winship, I was asked to moderate this panel. So I will do my best to help guide us, but we have 4 very interesting presentations, and really the core of what we're going to do today is hear from each of the presenters about their work, and then do a little digging into what the implications are for communities, how this is meaningful, how communities will kind of see and accept this, and kind of where we go from here. And we certainly will have plenty of time as well for questions and discussions with everybody. So we'll have a presentation, a little more interaction, and then so first I want to bring up Alex. I should have asked you. Chomik from Harvard, and again, it's right here, so I won't tell you all about it. But I think you'll find this very interesting as you go all the presentations. And I'll just say quickly, our other presenters are Jenna and Emily Rothman.
My name's Ashlee, and I'm here on behalf of Emily.
And Jeff Moyer. And so I'll let each of them just introduce themselves briefly rather than my trying to recreate what they can tell you about themselves. So again, thank you for being here. And with no further ado, I'm going to ask Alex to come on up.
Thank you. So as Brian said, I'm Alex Chomik. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard University in the sociology department, and my project is on examining the differences between police-defined and empirically defined co-offending groups. So what I mean by a police-defined co-offending group in this case is a street gang. A widely accepted definition of a street gang is any durable, street-oriented youth group whose involvement is in illegal activities as part of its group identity. So why do we care about gang membership other than kind of the obvious? To make that a little bit more clear, we can think about how important gang membership is to law enforcement and crime prevention. There are specific units dedicated just to enforcing the law with respect to gang members and tracking them in some way and trying to tamp down any violence or crime associated with them. It also affects people on an individual level, specifically gang members, obviously. Being involved in the criminal justice system has impacts throughout the life course. If someone gets arrested, once they're involved in the criminal justice system, that can impact them in terms of employment. They could also go to prison or jail, which obviously impacts later on employment and social outcomes and even mortality. So my 2 main research questions are: how do the official and empirical definitions of co-offending groups differ, and how do these compare in helping us understand individual involvement in crime? Previous literature on this work shows that peers obviously affect one's offending, and that gang membership actually affects another person's offending beyond the effects of peers. So it seems there is something special about being a gang member when it comes to being involved in crime. But we also know that gangs are a little bit less cohesive than we would expect. Gang members can offend across gang boundaries and with people not in gangs. So it's important to think about a whole network of offenders and understanding co-offending in groups of people offending together. The data that I used for this project is 2007 to 2014 arrest data given to me by the Boston Police Department through a project with Anthony Braga of Northeastern. The data is a total of 120,000, almost 800 incidents. 13,275 of these are co-arrest incidents, which means more than one person was arrested for the same crime, which I take to mean that they were involved in committing that crime together. The total number of individuals throughout this time period involved in any arrest is 71,814, but the total number of individuals involved in a co-arrest, meaning more than one person involved in that arrest, is 3,579 people. So this almost 24,000 people is who I focus on. I have some numbers on gang-involved incidents and individuals in this data, but I'm going to focus on the whole network with the 2,175 gang members just being a part of it. So when I say network, what I mean is that there are multiple arrests. Obviously, as I showed you, there's the 13,275 incidents that involve more than one person. So let's say in arrest 1, it's person A and person B. They now have a tie on the right. Because they only have one arrest between the two of them, that tie strength is 1 over the 8 years. Person B and person C are involved in 2 separate arrests together. So they also have a tie between them, but that tie strength is 2 because they have 2 different arrests associated with that relationship between them. In terms of identifying who is a gang member in the network, it is based on a BPD database of gang members. There were a total of 124 gangs in this database, but only 122 of these are shown in the arrest data for this time period. So that means that the gang members in the last 2 weren't arrested at any time, weren't co-arrested at any time in that period. How the gang database works is that gang members are verified using a point system, which assigns different values to different types of situations, be it that someone self-admits that they're a gang member, there's a published news account that they're in a certain gang, or there's information from an informant, among other things. There's no one point value, one thing that will give you enough points to be a gang member. You have to have at least 2 different types of conditions or multiple of the same type, be it multiple arrests or other situations. So as I said before, there's 2,175 gang members in this co-offending network. So in order to find the empirically defined groups, which is based on this network of co-arrests together, I cluster individuals into communities using the fast-greedy algorithm, which is a social network algorithm, and it takes into account that tie strength that I mentioned before. So people are more likely to be in the same community if they have a stronger tie, as well as have ties in general to other people that are connected within that group. Then I examine how these gangs differ from co-offending groups and compare their differential involvement in criminal activity. So this is a visualization of the entire network. You can't see too much information from it, but there is one main component in the middle that is 21.2% of all people. There are, as I said before, 122 gangs represented here, 23,579 people, aka nodes, and 25,166 relationships, aka ties between the 2 people. The mean degree centrality, which means the mean number of people that someone is connected to, is 2.13. So after running this fast-greedy algorithm and finding communities, I found 6,666 communities of these almost 24,000 individuals. But this graphic, as you can see on the x-axis, is cluster size. So the sizes vary from 2 at a minimum to 676 as a maximum. I took that one out just for the visualization aspect of it. And on the y-axis is the percentage of the cluster members that are gang members. So you can see that it varies a lot over the span. And in terms of clusters that have a size any bigger than 50, there's only one cluster, which is the red dot, that has 0% gang members. So every cluster larger than 50 has at least 1 gang member, when you can see the percentage varies as size varies. A lot of the clusters are in this 2 to 3 range. In fact, 84% of the communities are size 2 or 3. So that's something to take into account, where we wouldn't really compare that to gangs in the same way. So the main results that I was interested in looking at were rates of offending and co-offending. So co-offending is obviously part of the definition of the network, but it's something we should think about when we're thinking about gangs and groups that offend together. So the top graph is the co-offending rate by group types. That means the number of co-offenses that the group committed, but divided by the number of people, hence the rate. So gangs are on top and communities are on the bottom. The mean is the diamond. Just to note that these 2 axes are different. So the top axis shows the co-offending rate, number per group, where the mean for gangs is 0.5 and the mean for The mean for communities is 0.55, so co-offending is pretty similar. Obviously, distributions are a little different, but we're on a very small scale, so keep that in mind. Now, if we're talking about the offending rate, this includes just arrests by yourself. So obviously, gang members and non-gang members get arrested outside of this co-offending context, and it's important to think about their individual offending as a group in terms of comparing groups to groups. So the offending rate is, as you can see, the distribution is higher for gangs than communities, even taking into account the number of people for these groups. This is only for groups with more than 5 members, given that we saw how skewed it was to 2 and 3 members. The mean offending rate for gangs was 3.95 offenses, and the mean offending rate for communities was 2.1. So as you can see, there are differences between the officially and empirically defined groups. You can see kind of the size of them, as well as the number of communities. This is still preliminary work, and I'm still going to add data and things like that to better understand it, but this is a first cut. So these findings replicate that some gang members are in the offending groups. As you could see, there was no group except for one that had 0% gang members when we're talking about sizes above 50 members. It also suggests that current gang classification may not capture all criminal groups because there were so many groups in the larger areas that didn't even have 50 to 60% gang members. So there is a mismatch of some sort. Future work can predict individual offending, accounting for the offending group versus gang membership, demographic attributes, and the structure of co-offending, taking into account this network and how people are related to each other. And hopefully we can improve the understanding of gang classification and its meaning when it comes to individual and group offending. Thank you.
I am Jenna Savage. I am I'm now Deputy Director of the Office of Research and Development, very new, at the Boston Police Department. And I co-authored this with Dr. Melissa Morabito from UMass Lowell. So if you have any questions, you can also pop in. I should mention this evaluation is funded by the BJA through our Justice and Mental Health grant. We obviously know that mental health is a large part of officers' jobs. And so the numbers tend to say about maybe 10 to 20% of all calls that police encounter include a mental health component, but talking to officers, they'll say it's easier to count the number of calls that don't have a mental health component, because it's ubiquitous, and it's going to be a part of officers' job. So in 2017 alone, based on EMS data, we know, I should start off by saying emotionally disturbed persons is how it's coded. It's not very PC, but that's how it's coded. So we have 2 different types of calls in Boston. We have EDP2 and EDP3. EDP3 is a lower level type of call where there's no threat of violence to self or others, no one's going to get hurt. And to those calls, Boston EMS responds alone. EDP2 calls are those where there is some component of violence or threat of to self or others. And those are called, so those involve a co-response with EMS and Boston Police. And so in 2017 alone, there were over almost 6,000 EDP2 calls in the city of Boston, and about 3,000 EDP3 calls. And we know from the literature, and just from experience, that there are 3 major responses for police to people with mental health issues. The most common or the most popular is CIT, which is crisis intervention training. Does anyone here not know what CIT is? I'm just not sure. It's pretty well known at this point. But it's when you actually train a specialized unit of officers, usually about, I think, 40 officers maybe? 10%, thank you. 10% of officers get trained in 40 hours of training, and then it's just a police-only response to people with mental health problems, and they are your specialized unit. As opposed to a mobile crisis, where it's only clinicians. You might be able to call just clinicians to the scene, but issues there will also be that they don't have the blue lights and they can't have the cruiser, so you might take a while for them to get there. But another model is co-response, which is kind of gaining popularity. That's where you have officers co-responding with clinicians. They ride along with them in their cars. Clinicians are on scene with officers when they encounter people with mental health issues or substance abuse problems, and so they can actually do a co-response on scene. In the city of Boston, Boston Police Department adopted that model. Adopted that model in about 2000. Well, we formally adopted it in 2010, but we got our first co-responding clinician in 2011. And it was initially through grant funds. but now we actually have a combination of grant funds and permanent operating budget funds supporting it, and we're expanding it more and more, and I can talk to you about that all day long if you want to hear about it. Actually, I guess what I'm talking about. So traditionally, before we worked with BEST, and I should tell you about BEST, the Boston Emergency Services team is our local emergency services program. So they are our mobile clinicians. So you can just call BEST to any call and they'll come, but it could take them up to an hour. So when we got these grant funds, we basically ended up moving to co-response where we're using these BEST clinicians to ride along with our officers. But prior to that, basically the three main outcomes you would see are either they would just put the person in an ambulance and send them to the hospital, which can be very expensive and time consuming, and oftentimes the person's right back out again. It might just require the person to move along, and there's no treatment given, no referrals, no nothing. Or the person could end up being arrested, which obviously in some cases is the right response, but if it's not, it's really not going to do the person any justice. They're not going to get the services they need when you get them in the criminal justice program, criminal justice system, and it becomes so much harder to get back out. So again, starting with first state funds and then federal funds starting in 2010, 2011, we've now been hiring BEST clinicians specifically to be designated in police districts to ride along with our officers. And it's really led to some fantastic changes. So when we have a clinician riding along with our officers, this is kind of a basic layout of how it works. The clinician gets paired with an officer, and I should stress that is supposed to be voluntary, and you know it doesn't always work out that way. I'm being told that officers get voluntold. So I mean, there's always, it's complicated. But they get paired with an officer. The dispatch is supposed to be told where they're working. They're also supposed to have their own call signs. They can call off and let dispatch know where they are. And they ride along, and they basically listen. They can either listen in on calls to say, oh, we hear something that sounds like it has a mental health component, or, oh, I know that address, I know that person, and they can call off on the call. Or dispatch, being aware that they are on service at that time, can say, hey, we have an EDP call somewhere, you can dispatch them to it. And then they respond on the scene. Clinician stays in the car until it's been secured, but they do have a vest. I mean, this is a real deal. But then when it's safe for them to get out of the car, they get out and they can do a lot on scene. And then depending on the situation and depending on whether EMS is present, so every scene is going to be different. So the police versus BEST clinician versus EMS might all have different thoughts about what the right outcome is. But ideally, they're going to come to a consensus about should this person be arrested, should they be diverted from arrest, should they go to the emergency room. Wonderfully enough, the clinician can provide all sorts of services on scene or say, hey, here's my card, we'll come back to you. There's actually a drop-off center that avoids the emergency room. It's at 85 East Newton Center, so they can be dropped off and not have to go to emergency room. So having that clinician present just gives the officers so many more tools. Yeah, okay. So outcomes to date, we barely worked with BEST at all prior to these grants. So in 2010, we only had 25 people referred to them directly by officers compared to 2017, when we were up to 509 directly referred to them. And also 2017, keeping in mind that we've had a lot of turnover in our clinicians, we actually were without any for quite a while. And even then, we had 37 interventions where ED and an ambulance trip was avoided, which DMH, last I heard, estimated costs about $4,000 per ambulance trip in ED. 42 people were seen in holding cells. That's another thing that clinicians can do. And then also through BEST's regular 1-800 number, over 200 people were referred to BEST through that. And then we are doing, as I said, an evaluation. We have BJA funds. We're working with Dr. Morabito. And we have a bunch of different data sets. One of them is over 1,000 cases of data collected by the BEST clinicians. And so in that data, which covered work from 2011 to 2015, we only had 2 clinicians working during that time in a couple different areas of the city. And most of the time, the clinicians, when I say they were not in a dedicated car, what I mean is that they're not just responding to mental health cars, unfortunately. So if the person's in a car and a robbery is called in and they're the closest to it, they have to sit and wait in the car while the officer goes respond to a robbery. The issue there being staffing. In order to have just a mental health car, requires taking one of our regular staff members or one of our BPD officers out of the regular rotation, which then requires overtime. So we're working on that. But what kind of calls were they responding to? And as you can see, I don't need to read it to you, but there were some where there were criminal charges involved. 10% involved substance abuse. Lots involved suicidal ideation, children's mental health crises, family disputes. We've also started doing interviews. Melissa has interviewed so far only 7 officers who have corresponded with our previous clinicians. And so far from them, we've kind of asked them all about how do you think the co-responder program's working out? Do you think it's good to have them off the clinicians there? And we're getting pretty mixed reviews on that. I think there's a lot of concerns about liability of having an officer, having a clinician in the car and having to worry about their safety, but they do see the value in having a clinician there for de-escalation on scene. Mostly cops don't want to have to do this. They don't feel like this should be their job. So having someone on scene who can quiet someone down and de-escalate is really helpful. There's a lot of frustration from the interviews that we saw of BPD with EMS. And I think there's just a lot of tensions there that we're trying to work on overcoming. And then challenges, there have been plenty. Resources, we've lost clinicians due to grant funding. That's part of the life of grants. You know, police in general are still kind of resistant to having these clinicians, and we're trying to work on a bit of a culture change. We still don't have a dedicated car, which leads to a wasted time for some clinicians. Personnel turnover, getting buy-in. I mean, every district is different. Some captains really embrace them as a tool. Others just, if the captain doesn't buy in, the officers are just not going to do it. And then tracking data, which I know data is the big thing, but you know, even earlier when I talked about the number of EDP calls we had, I had to use EMS data for that because their numbers were better for EDP calls than police's were, even though they should be identical. And tracking the number of mental health calls is really hard because most calls that involve mental health don't have an EDP nature code. It might be family dispute or domestic violence or you name it, but it's really hard to quantify how many calls involve mental health. So we're constantly working on that issue as well. Next steps, we're hiring more clinicians. We're going to do a dedicated car for a period of time to evaluate the cost savings there and hopefully be able to make a case for, yes, you have to pay overtime, but worth it. Looking more at the BEST data, where officers are starting to get CIT trained. And BPD, BEST, and EMS are also all heavily involved in a community justice workshop, if anyone's familiar with that, the sequential intercept mapping that I'm also happy to talk to anybody about if they're interested in that. Is that? Yep, all right. Thank you for your time.
Hi everyone, my name is Jeff Moyer. I'm a doctoral candidate at the UMass Boston, and my dissertation project, I am working on looking at marijuana legalization, sort of the after effects of it, specifically in Massachusetts. This is sort of only one facet of my dissertation. The larger dissertation is looking at the implementation of marijuana legalization and state policy innovation that occurs during that process. And then the second part of it is sort of what you'll see here, which is looking at sort of the racial equity implications for communities that have been traditionally hit by the criminalization of cannabis. What impacts do deliberate policies that Massachusetts is trying to implement have to sort of rehabilitate those communities and try to sort of affect the after, and create more equity. So as a policy context, as I'm sure most here know, Massachusetts voters legalized recreational cannabis in Proposition 4 in 2015. The legislature then put its own stamp on legalization and changed a few things, tinkered around the edges, but largely kept most things the same. In those, a lot of that legislation and complicated legalese, there was a few specific equity provisions that were inserted both in the ballot initiative and the layer legislation. One thing that was different from previous states that had legalized cannabis was that Massachusetts made it so that people with previous cannabis convictions were not disqualified from holding licenses under the law. The legislature also then expanded the Cannabis Control Commission to include one person that had an expertise in social equity as their background, and that person is, I'm trying to remember her name right now, I can't. But anyway, she's now serving on the Cannabis Control Commission and is sort of directing efforts to help create more equity in the licensed legal cannabis market. And they also, most importantly and most recently, they created regulations that gave certain people qualifying in these sort of communities of color or communities of impact, as they define it, where qualifying applicants could apply early for cannabis licenses, and they still have to meet all the other requirements, but they can apply early and they can sort of get not extra consideration, but more time to prepare their applications. And the communities of disproportionate impact are identified right there. It's not all of Boston. Boston and Springfield, there are only certain census tracts that qualify. And as I'll outline later, there were very specific reasons why these were chosen through statistics and some mapping. So as I'm sure many folks here might know, drug enforcement and specifically also cannabis enforcement has often been a very racially disparate sort of environment where black people and other minorities were subject to arrest at much higher rates than white people for the same crimes. Now, polling and other evidence will show you that whites and other racial groups use cannabis at very similar rates, or basically 1 or 2% difference. But you're seeing that black or African Americans are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis use, including 3.9 times in Massachusetts. This data is from the ACLU. They released one report back in 2013, and then the Mass ACLU released a follow-up report several years later, looking specifically at the impact of decriminalization and what that had on arrests in Massachusetts. Now, the good news on decriminalization is that, if you don't know, Massachusetts voters passed a decriminalization initiative back in 2008 that basically took most cannabis possession offenses down from a misdemeanor to a civil citation that was usually a $100 fine or something like that. So the good news with, at least with decriminalization, is that it reduced cannabis arrests wholesale by 90%. So it had a major effect, bringing arrests from about 10,000 a year to about 1,000 or 2,000. But you still saw those racial disparities, with African Americans still being 3.3 times likely to be arrested for possession, and 7.1 times as likely for sales. And you can see that graph shows you the race of, or the impact of arrests, the number of arrests that went down. You see that major go down. And in 2014, that was the racial gap of arrests. And so just to emphasize, this is research I mostly have not yet done. So I'm working on this for my dissertation project. And so my research questions in this specific area are looking at the success rate of equity applicants who apply under that early licensing program. Are they as likely to succeed as other applicants including on the day sales begin, 6 months after, and 1 year after? Does the introduction of legal cannabis establishments in these particular communities reduce the unemployment rate? So when the Cannabis Control Commission looked at creating those communities impact, they looked at two different variables. They looked at the number of cannabis arrests in those jurisdictions, as well as the unemployment rate, to measure which areas had disproportionate impact from criminalization. And so I'm basically using the Cannabis Control Commission's logic to sort of test their own effectiveness and see whether there's an actual impact from creating this special licensing program. And I'm also going to take a comparison state, such as Colorado or Oregon or Washington, that implemented these cannabis legalization without a similar equity program. I'm going to see what happened there, and see if there's a noticeable comparison between the two states. And then I'm also going to look more broadly, not just sort of at the quantitative data, but also qualitative data, interview people from those communities to see how they think the legal cannabis market, taxes generated from it, and sort of the whole experience of legalization will impact these communities, and whether it will help them or whether it will just be sort of a net neutral. So my methods will sort of replicate the Getman, who did the analysis for the Cannabis Control Commission and sort of defined those neighborhoods. I'm going to replicate his definition to look at either Colorado or Washington to basically create similar neighborhoods as a test case. And I'll collect licensee data from the agencies, both in Massachusetts and in my comparison state. I'm also going to use GIS methods to compare with the citing of where cannabis establishments are and compare them with alcohol establishments, which the literature tells us are concentrated in very poor and minority areas. And then also some qualitative research. So this is off of not this project, but another project I did a year ago. And this is the distribution of cannabis and alcohol establishments in the city of Denver. If you see the green are cannabis and the red are alcohol. And the more sort of orange or reddish that is, the more low income or minority it is. And so as you can see, there's clear concentration and there's actually clear differentiation. More cannabis out here. And so that there is obviously sort of some impact or some differentiation between where these establishments are being cited. And I'd like to learn more about sort of why there's a difference and what considerations are going in on that. So this is sort of a side project, but I still plan on doing follow-up things for that for my later research. And so I'm happy to hear any feedback, and that's sort of my contribution. Thanks for listening.
I can switch a lot. Is that me on this? Just gonna set it right here. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ashlee. I have a background in public health. Today I'm going to present the preliminary results. The preliminary results of a longitudinal evaluation of a Boston-based intervention designed to prevent sex trafficking of minors. Disclaimer, I'm not going to present anything particularly harrowing, but the topic of sex trafficking is heavy. So, our project is funded by the National Institute of Justice. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a definition of domestic minor sex trafficking. It's defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. The qualifiers are that they're under the age of 18, they are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, and it has to take place within domestic borders. Our study evaluated the My Life, My Choice program, which is a program of the Justice Resource Institute here in Boston, and it offers a variety of services, including advocacy, mentoring, and education prevention programs for youth with the goal of eliminating the violence of sexual exploitation. For this part of the study, there was many parts. For this part, we're focusing on the prevention groups themselves, which are generally a 10-session curriculum held in schools, residential facilities, or in the community, such as Boys and Girls Club or DCF offices. And the sessions focus on improving knowledge and attitudes about healthy relationships, giving youth skill sets in terms of assessing their own self-esteem or finding resources when they're in trouble, changing attitudes about the commercial sex industry, and such as, getting rich is what matters, which is not true. You don't get rich from exploitation. And my favorite part of the whole curriculum is that it was created by survivors of trafficking themselves, and these people are in the sessions with the youth. And there's been a little bit of shift because there's a higher need, so that we don't have enough survivors to be in every single group, so often they co-lead or they come into one session to talk to the girls. The people who participate in the groups are young women who are considered at risk, and you are determined at risk by a clinician, a school counselor, other youth providers, and if they see these signs, they refer them to the My Life, My Choice program. This is the logic model for our study. We're focused on primary and secondary outcomes such as decreasing sexual exploitation, decreasing partner abuse, victimization, reducing substance abuse, decreasing depression, etc., everything else listed in there, and with the ultimate goal of reduction in sex trafficking. We also plan to conduct a cost-effective analysis of the program. To be in this study, you had to be in a My Life, My Choice prevention group in either Florida, Connecticut, New Jersey, or Massachusetts, fluent in English, and 11 years and older. Now, our age cutoff was originally 14 years old, but we got into the groups and realized that girls are at risk at a much younger age, and the youngest girl was 11 years old. So we were often in middle schools. For our data collection, we administered 3 surveys at 3 different time points. At baseline, which is the first session of the group, the last day of the group, which is follow-up test number 1, and then 6 months after, which is follow-up test number 2. We had, and between each of we administered what we call contact checks, and where we gave someone a piece of paper and they filled out social media accounts or phone numbers or anything that any person or way we can contact them. So we essentially every month we maintained contact to follow up with them, and they're considered hard to reach, which means that often their phone numbers didn't work, their social media accounts changed, and actually that was my job for most of this study, was keeping track of youth. And I should say that what is particularly astonishing about the study is that at post-test number 1, we had an 84% completion rate, so the follow-up, and at post-test number 2, we had 69% completion rate, which is kind of unheard of. So here are some preliminary baseline characteristics. The mean age of, and I should say that the N is 296, although we have data from 356 people. This is only the people who completed baseline and post-test. Some youth completed baseline and follow-up. Number 2, but I'm presenting these 2 data points to you. So the mean age was 15 and a half years old. As I said, the range was as low as 11 years old and as high as 20 years old. Mostly everyone identified as female. We have the racial distribution. We have the sexual orientation, which is particularly astonishing because this question was added later on, gender and sexuality. And so 126 people responded to this, and almost half of them were queer, which I think is huge, in my opinion, and actually is something I'm most passionate about in this study. Most of the groups took place in residential facilities, and almost everyone, almost all of them took place in Massachusetts. Some more characteristics that we were interested in was in whether they were not they were enrolled in school, and you can see from baseline to post-test that not much changed. The number of places that they lived in the past 6 months, so their level of instability, essentially. There's not much change according to the p-value. The use of alcohol in the past month, more than 1 day in the past month, use of marijuana. Not much change from baseline to post-test. Encouraging results are in dating abuse, knowledge and attitudes exploitation, and helping others. So we had different measures, and for each of these buckets, we had questions that were mostly original, and there was a scale. So they, on a scale of 1 to 5, they answered each of the questions. And for example, a dating abuse question would be, has a partner pushed, grabbed, hit, beat, or hurt you physically in the past 30 days? Knowledge and attitudes, only girls who are addicted to drugs get pimped out. A good boyfriend or girlfriend listens to your worries and doesn't yell at you or make you feel guilty. Exploitation, in the past 30 days, have you exchanged sex for money, food, a place to stay, drugs, gifts, or favors? And helping others, I have educated a friend about the myths and facts of selling sex. And our results show that there are reduced odds in all the first 3. The helping others, I didn't have the data for some reason, so I'm showing you the first 3. And overall, there's a reduced odds, meaning at post-test for dating abuse, there was an 83% reduction in odds of reporting that they had been abused. Discussion. The evaluation of the commercial sex exploitation of children prevention programs is very new. There are a few groups out there, but it's in the beginning stages, and this will be one of the first to be a full evaluation of these programs. And so we're excited to see how these results can inform, in this context, police. And as you can see, that the preliminary results of the post-test are encouraging for our primary outcomes. Limitations are there is no control group. However, we did collect attendance data to measure dosage. So essentially answering the question is, did you have better outcomes if you attended more groups? Measurements, as I said, our questions were original, and since our study started in 2015, there have been, with the increase in interest of this topic, measures, human trafficking tool measures to measure exploitation. And so that's what I have for you today. Thank you, and I also want to acknowledge all the young participants who made this study possible.
All right. So I'm afraid to touch this now. All right. So let's give another round of applause to our presenters, please. See how this goes. I think this will work okay. So there's a lot to take in from all of that. Obviously, a lot of this is still research that is in progress. There's more work to be done, but I think there's a lot here. And thinking about the theme of this, about improving law enforcement, I guess I want to ask each of you, and I'll keep this mic and you guys can share that, just briefly. I mean, we heard about gang affiliation. We heard about EDP, emotionally disturbed person response and co-responder model, cannabis, sex trafficking, and especially the concern about LGBTQ plus communities and their intersection with that. But I guess I just ask each of you briefly, could you say something about, from your perspectives, having done this work, what do you see as the lessons? Like, what's a lesson already that you've drawn? Maybe just start with you, if you don't mind, Jeff.
I mean, one of the biggest lessons I had was just the scale, and like before I really sort of dove into the cannabis issue, was just the scale of disparity of arrests between minority communities and non-minority communities. And honestly, like that fact is 3 times more likely. Like that should not, like there needs to be a lot more effort by the cannabis industry to sort of help and revitalize these communities that have been really hit by criminalization.
I guess my lesson partially is understanding a new way to measure groups of co-offending and maybe thinking about different ways of defining people that would want to be either targeted in terms of prevention or identification, and maybe thinking about gang desistance in a wider framework with behavior in this kind of network context.
Could you just say a little bit more about that, sort of like from the community perspective, law enforcement, both? What do you?
Law enforcement primarily in terms of identification and desistance, but in those cases it can also obviously include a community perspective. But if you're measuring through arrests, other police-generated data, you have to think about how that primary organization.
I mean, there have been a lot of lessons, but I guess one of the best ones I've learned is just how important it is to get the right people involved. The program, we started in 2010 or 2011 with the wheels just kind of spinning and how hard it was, but once you get buy-in from the right people, and a good example is that we've been working with EMS a lot more lately, so we finally got the right people at the table, and it just took a lot to kind of make any strides there. But Commissioner Evans has been really great about kind of empowering this program, and until you get the top-down buy-in, it's just not going to really go anywhere, and City Council has been really supportive too, and so just that key of getting the right people involved, or else it's not going to go anywhere at all, with or without funding.
I think my takeaway lesson is that you can't approach this issue with tunnel vision. There's a lot happening for these youth, and there's a lot of intersectionality in terms of their identities and their lived experiences, which are rooted in systemic injustice, homelessness, poverty, economic instability. And so you have to look at the interplay of all of those things to understand, just to begin to try to understand what someone is going through when they're in this position.
So let me just follow up, and maybe we can kind of go back the other way. So if say you were presenting to a room of law enforcement leaders, say a bunch of police chiefs or people who are in charge of special investigations units, what would you want them to know about the people that you've worked with and what you've understood from people? I mean, you sort of said about the issues, but thinking about what they would need to know as people working with people, as practitioners.
This shouldn't be happening because of safe harbor laws, but youth are arrested for prostitution and other charges, and often the view of the officer, this is general, is that they're doing something bad. They don't see them as survivors or as victims, and they're like, this young person is just drugged out, without understanding that maybe they're hooked on drugs because their pimp got them hooked on drugs, and that maybe they're with a pimp because they don't have a place to live or they don't have food to eat. So what I think is the most important for officers to internalize and recognize and put into practice is work on reframing biases, challenge the current model of approaching youth who have been prostituted, and see the weaknesses in it and maybe even the parts that perpetuate the injustices, and use the trauma-informed care and ultimately see themselves, and I'm interested because most of them don't see themselves as working with mental health stuff, but they're really on the front lines of being protectors of these youth, and I think that if they could reframe a little bit and do some unlearning of some biases, I think it could go a long way.
And I'll just ask everyone to sort of address that in your own way, from your own.
I love everything you said. With the mental health department, this is why there's a peer component to this for a reason. We have forensic peer specialists who have lived experience, and they can represent people who have that lived experience, and family members of people who have that lived experience. Because, again, when you are a cop on scene, it's kind of hard to see past the fact that this person just has a knife or whatever it is that happened. But, there can be a lot of issues, and someone may have just called the police out of desperation because their son is having an issue. But, no one wants to see arrest, no one wants to see no one get hurt. And so I do think that it's great that we're getting more and more officers CIT training. So I think it does break through a lot of that, those biases of just kind of understanding that it's better to de-escalate. It's great to have someone on scene who doesn't necessarily have a uniform on, and so maybe that will kind of calm them down a bit, and just kind of understanding that these are someone's loved ones. And so I think as much as it's great to also pair with clinicians, I think that more and more officers themselves train, because they're still the ones who are carrying weapons, and they're still the first ones through the door, and their job is to protect. And so I think it's important to kind of get through and have them think about who they're serving, including the families. I think the more officers are trained to think about who they're serving, the better.
I think that it's important for officers to think about what being a gang member or classifying a gang member, this goes for officers, analysts, and even general public, what that really means, and if we should be thinking about it in a different context, if we should think about what actions are really make up that label, if it's not really just gangs, if it's other kinds of youth groups. Obviously, there are gangs that have names that are including individuals who identify in that way, wear certain clothing, have certain kind of allegiances, but there's clearly more to the story, and there's a lot more people in the network that are either involved or related to gang members in some other way. So it's important to think about who else can be involved and where else you can kind of target strategies so that you're preventing crime in a more global way.
Great, thanks.
I think for me, it's mostly just that, as you see, and this is proven over multiple states where you still have a huge disparity, even though the number of arrests have gone down for cannabis arrests, there's still a huge disparity between the racial groups. And I think just having some law enforcement reconsider why they're arresting people, where they're arresting people for cannabis-related offenses that still remain illegal, and sort of maybe challenge the reasons behind that disparity, and think a little bit critically about, the policies behind it. Because especially now that cannabis is moving into a legalized space, where the concern for the state more generally, not just law enforcement, is sort of trying to discourage the black market and try to move people to the regulated space. I think it's especially important that, if there are people operating in the unregulated space, that it's not just arresting people and sending them through the criminal justice system. It's trying to move them into the regulated space, encourage them to move there, not force them to move there, because you just don't want to have that continued disparity in arrests just moving forward.
Okay. So I want to make sure we get to the rest of the people in the room, but I do have one last question I want to ask you to try to address quickly, and that would be, understanding the impact of data on communities and how people often see themselves reflected in data as being marginalized or being targeted, or as being said, this community is messed up in a sense. How do you think that communities will view your research, and is there something you would hope communities would be able to see and do with your research when you're done? That's a big question to answer quickly, but do your best.
I mean, for me, since I will be specifically targeting communities that the Cannabis Control Commission has identified as having been impacted by criminalization, I would hope they view my research as sort of a way for them to talk about this issue about racial equity more globally, as society legalizes cannabis, and as we sort of address what the societal harms that criminalization occurred, sort of what they would like to see and how they measure equity and all those issues.
As I progress with this work, I hope to kind of situate it spatially in Boston, and so then I'll get a better sense of community, and the ultimate goal is really to understand how crime is dispersed through networks across the city and different crime types, and understanding different severities and how it might escalate in some groups, not other groups, depending on what community and physical location they're in. So I'm hoping that in that way I can really help prevent crime, which is honestly the ultimate goal, understand it first in order to prevent in some ways.
The community part is huge. I mean, the way we got our city operating budget funding was that there was a city council hearing after an incident in the South End, and it's because of that community input that we were able to get more money to expand and get more clinicians, and the goal is to eventually do this evaluation so we can show that it's not only important for the human aspect, but obviously we can also convince the city that it's going to save money by fewer emergency department visits, fewer ambulance rides, officer money, officer time saved, you name it. There's a lot of cost savings involved, as well as the human element. And between all of these things, worth the funding to get clinicians in every district, and then maybe someday move to a citywide unit, whatever it's going to be. But I think community input is going to be huge, and I do think that they'll be in favor. But we're in touch with city council the whole way, and we, I think the community is going to be in strong favor of this. I think it's a good thing.
I think it's that this data should be used as a tool for the community, and it's important for the, I guess, almost a shift in the power dynamic. The people who are collecting the data take a step back, and the community members get to do what they want with it and tell their stories, and it's very similar to this model at My Life, My Choice. It's survivor-led. Their stories come first, and the reason why it works is because survivors themselves, community members themselves, are the ones telling their stories. If I went in and tried to be like, sex trafficking is bad, they're not going to it's not going to resonate with these youths. So I think it's always the most important for the community members at the forefront, and take a step back and let them. You are a tool to them.
Great. All right, well, thank you. So let's open it up. I think my understanding is that this is being recorded, so I'll try to repeat briefly questions for the future. So, please.
I have two questions quick for Jeff. First of all, how did they define communities of disproportionate impact? And I'll give you a second, then you can say that. Is your max at the end? I think that the first one seemed to suggest that there was higher concentration of alcohol in the lower income communities, and cannabis in the higher income communities.
Somewhat, yeah.
And then I couldn't figure out, I didn't have time to look at the second map, which looked at the racial patterns. So if you could just talk about those two things?
Sure.
Okay, so it was, what's the definition of the communities of disparate impact, and what's the sort of difference around alcohol and cannabis in racial and economic?
All right, so to your first question, the researcher that the Cannabis Control Commission hired basically took two different statistics, arrests and unemployment rates, and basically looked at where the arrests were highest, and then where the unemployment rate was also sort of highest in a certain, I think it was like a 5-year time frame from like 2011 to 2015, something like that. And he basically picked those communities in the census tracts in Boston. I think there was also some demographics that went into that. I forget exactly how the multiplier worked on that, but it was mostly a function of unemployment and arrest rates that were sort of used to determine those specific areas. And then to answer your second question, I do remember from my analysis of the maps that I have, the cannabis stores were definitely located in whiter areas. Whiter, slightly more wealthy, not the wealthiest areas, and alcohol shops were disproportionately in low-income minority areas where there was sort of deep poverty, and that was just Denver. I also looked at the other, trying to remember the other major city in Colorado. There were similar patterns going on there. So I expect that obviously there aren't licensed cannabis stores in Massachusetts yet. I would not be surprised if we see similar patterns here, but I want to look at it sort of a more granular level and look at the communities and look what impact that cannabis establishments have.
I guess almost in the back. And then,
So I have a question following up on cannabis about business owners. And if we think of the informal market today and the people who are the owners of those businesses versus the people who will operate the new licensed establishments, I worry a little bit about displacement of the current entrepreneurs. Because when you read about the, MBAs and the private equity, blah, blah, blah. So what I want to know is, in Colorado and places that are ahead of us on this, has there been study of the economic impact, and is it disparate?
So again, to repeat the question, try this very quickly. Looking at the informal marketplace that exists currently, and then the more formal marketplace of licensed sellers, has there been displacement in other states where there's been legalization of economically less advantaged people by new business?
And racial disparity.
And racial disparity in that.
So to answer your question, there hasn't been any comprehensive research, at least that I haven't looked in the past like 4 or 5 months, but I have not seen any. When I did a very intense literature search, that's not something that people are studying. It's possible that there are studies going on right now because this is obviously a very new, very fresh issue. In order to open a cannabis store in Colorado, you had to have about $250,000 in assets that you could access at any given time. Massachusetts has specifically lowered those drastically. They've lowered the licensing fees. They've done a lot of things sort of in reaction to the perception that the Colorado market favored sort of established wealthier interests with lots of capital. So that's going to be another factor in sort of my analysis. I can speak the same exactly for Washington because I've learned more about Colorado, which is probably why I'll focus on it. But Colorado is sort of the test case of what happened, what you probably should avoid doing for a legal market. And the other thing that I'll quickly add, the equity applicants are also going to be eligible to do home delivery. The Cannabis Control Commission delayed that for a year, but they're going to get first shot at the equity at the home delivery. So that might sort of encourage people to move from the informal market to the formal market.
I have a question about the getting involved work. So two questions. One, it was interesting to see the difference between getting involved in networks, or I don't remember the term exactly. I'm wondering first, did the police see them as separate, or do you have a sense of whether the game unit was kind of dealing with both groups? Because you involved, there's like a legal, a defined term versus a perception term and how it's dealt with by the police. And then the second part of that is, did you see anything that suggests that if police see a group as being gang involved, whether that's networked or the official version, do they treat them differently? Was it a higher, like a more intense threat for it and therefore treatment perception? You know what I mean?
Okay.
Because I guess that would be my on how they're perceiving people that may be peers and not necessarily gangs, but they're all lumped in the same perception. Does that make sense?
Okay. So I guess no. So I'm trying to. So I think one question is: were there differences, or did the police treat people who fit the legal definition of gang involved the same as those who fit the definition you used or popular perceptions? And then whoever the police consider in that category, do they treat them differently? Is there different treatment impact?
So for the first question, so the gang database is held and maintained by the Boston Police Department. So those are people that can officially be labeled as gang members because they fit a criteria. The network is like a later thing that I've now done, so it's not something that they are currently aware of in terms of like being presented in this way, but I'm sure, that any relationships that are being seen with like, so there's a difference between a gang member who's officially defined and meets every single criteria and maybe someone who seems like a gang member but can't be put into a database. So it's definitely possible that they are aware of people that are close to gang members but can't really be defined yet or be put into the database. And this.
Is there like a bigger universe of people they're treating as gang members even though they may not be in their database officially listed?
I think it's possible, but I can't answer that. Yeah. It wouldn't. I wouldn't be shocked to know that, and it's something that I can take into account as I go on, maybe making sure that people who are like co-arrested with gang members and seeing how different that is from people who are completely like steps away from gang members and how often those show up, and maybe that also gets at your second question, which I can see. So basically what you're saying is that gang members are naturally going to have more arrests because they're being paid attention to more.
Or just, I think about who gets the money in the police department. It seems like the police unit gets more than the human trafficking unit, for example. And that there's like more resources and more intensity of nervousness around gangs, right?
Yeah.
Treated more from the charges and everything.
Yeah, so is there sort of more intense policing or more focus or more resources going into this? I guess that's the question.
Yeah. I only laughed because I heard her say that you were.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I'm repeating for them.
Yeah, it's honestly my data can't really tell that at the moment, but I'm doing my best to kind of deal with it. I will be keeping that in mind, and I do have a secondary data source that's the field interrogation observations, but that's also based on police activity. So there will always be that aspect that I have to worry about, but that's not to, maybe there's things that are missing and there's ties and people that are missing my data because the police are focusing on people, but what I do have definitely like was an arrest and did happen. So I'm capturing the best that I can based on police activity.
Okay, so we're at about 3:47. I don't know if we have time for one or two more questions. One more question. So you have to have a question now because I've given you an opportunity to ask a question. So who has a question for these panels? Maybe someone who hasn't gotten a question before. All right, well I have a question. So I'll take the opportunity. As some of you may have heard, in Cambridge recently, about 2 weeks ago today, or was it? Yeah, there was an arrest of a young man who is a Harvard student who was, there are various characterizations of the incident, but basically was naked. His friends had indicated he had taken a hallucinogenic drug, and he was technically taken down, including some punches. apparently to try to get him to comply according to the police, so they could handcuff him, put him in an ambulance, and take him to the hospital. So just thinking specifically about the work we've been doing in Boston with the co-responder model, from this general situation, knowing Cambridge has some of that work, but not a specific co-responder